A couple of months ago, I made one of my favorite videos ever on this channel, talking about something that I called the Josh Jackson effect, and I'll leave the link in the description to that video if you've never seen it and you want a more in-depth explanation. But essentially, this is an idea that I came up with in which young NBA players that initially struggle at the beginning of a season then display what appears to be improvement as the year progresses, at least statistically, with those much higher per game averages in the later months of the season than the beginning. However, as that video explained, those stats are simply false and have way more to do with the circumstances around the player, aka getting more minutes and shot attempts as his team starts to tank post All-Star break, while also playing against worse competition as other teams also tank and or rest their players for the playoffs, than actual on-court improvement. This idea originally came from Josh Jackson in his time with the Phoenix Suns, thus why it's named after him, as his per game averages post All-Star break are dramatically better than his pre-All-Star break stats throughout his career. And in that video a few months ago, I used Cam Reddish as another example of a player that could be experiencing the Josh Jackson effect as well. So welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this Josh Jackson effect video that I did a couple months ago. Now, in the few months since that video was released, this idea has caught on a little bit throughout the NBA community. Mojo did a video on it and he DM'd me first. He was super cool about it. I will leave the link to that video down in the description below. And I've also seen it floating around NBA Instagram and Twitter. Some people tagging me to give me credit, and others, there are other people in the comments tagging me to give me credit as well. But in this video, I kind of want to expand on this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a handful of players, whether it be past seasons or this current NBA season, and identify some cases that were or were not the Josh Jackson effect, and then kind of find some things that we can learn about this so that we can kind of refine this idea a little bit more, so it's a little bit more clear what the Josh Jackson effect is and what qualifies a player for it. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy this type of content, then consider subscribing and leaving a like rating down below as well. It's a great way to let me know that you're enjoying the video, and it helps it out a ton as well. Let's begin with a past player, and that is Trey Burke. Now in the 2017-18 NBA season, Trey Burke was pretty much going nowhere with his NBA career, but then he signed a contract later in the season with the Knicks and actually got some minutes. And by this point in his career, he was pretty much 100% a top 10 bust as the 9th pick in the 2013 draft. But after signing that contract, he started to actually produce for the Knicks, and he looked like what he was supposed to when he came into the league. He could get to the rim with his quickness, create for others, and do some work in the mid-range as well. And this stretch of strong performances included a 42-point game in March of that season. Now, that Knicks team was really bad, and we're just kind of looking for any kind of value at the end of the season. And although Burke played well, it didn't transfer to the following season at all, as he was traded to Dallas in the Kristaps Porzingis trade after just 33 games the following year and has barely held on in the league since. And this is a great example of the Josh Jackson effect. This is a player that didn't actually improve to improve their stats. They just got some extra minutes and shot attempts and couldn't sustain that production in a situation in which they weren't given more opportunities than they should have been given ever in the first place. And this example with Burke shows how this Josh Jackson effect can apply to former high draft picks even a few years into their career, not just rookies and second-year guys. And as is pretty much always the case with this, Burke was playing on a bad team. But now we move on to a player that was on a good team and also showed some of the characteristics of a potential Josh Jackson effect player. And it's CJ McCollum back in his second season, the 2014-15 NBA season, on a 51-win Portland Trailblazers team. Now, McCollum got healthy at the end of that year and got increased minutes at the end of that season and put up some really good numbers. He was barely playing up until February, but post All-Star break, he started scoring really well. And then the following season, he was a 20-point per game guy and has been ever since. But the important distinction, two of them actually, between McCollum and Burke and some of the other players we're going to talk about are the fact that the Blazers were a good team and McCollum earned minutes anyway, even though they weren't tanking, and he produced in the playoffs. And I think those two things correlate to him continuing that production not only the following season, but throughout the rest of his career to this point. As you can see, he put up really good numbers in that postseason, and they were pretty much on par with the numbers he put up at the end of that season in April as well. And so that is an important distinction, is that it's more unlikely that a player is a Josh Jackson effect type guy if they are not only on a good team, but they also perform in the postseason. So this was not a Josh Jackson effect player because McCollum was actually able to sustain that production. But now let's talk about a player from this most recent season, and one that gets brought up a lot, with this Josh Jackson effect, and it's Malik Beasley. And the reason that I don't think that he's one of these players and why I think the production is legit is because he has shown signs of being a good player in Denver, and Denver has been a good team with him on the roster. He just wasn't getting a ton of minutes because that team was so deep on the perimeter. As you look at his stats from his 2018-19 season with Denver, playing almost every single game, firmly in the rotation, shooting the ball extremely well, and even though his statistics in Minnesota since the trade are incredibly high and the percentages are high and all those things look like maybe a Josh Jackson effect type player, I just think that Malik Beasley is a good player. Like, one of the reasons he was traded in the first place is because Denver didn't want to pay him, and that's another sign that this is just legit improvement. And the per game stat increase, yes, correlates with the minutes per game, which is one of the characteristics of a Josh Jackson effect type player, but the argument could also be made that Beasley just wasn't playing enough in Denver in the first place. So I think he's just a really good player. When you watch him play, I think he is legit as a guy that can shoot, can score, and can defend. I don't think he's going to be a future all-star or anything, but I don't think that the percentages and the numbers that he was putting up at the end of the year in Minnesota are going to be all that far off from what he's going to put up next season. He's not going to be a 20-point per game guy, but he can be like a teens point per game scorer, a good shooter, and a good defender as well. So I don't think this is an example of a Josh Jackson effect type player here for Malik Beasley this season. Another interesting player to look back on in the past as it relates to this is Jahlil Okafor, and he was a former 3rd overall pick that was productive initially on some really bad Philadelphia teams, but then bounced around the league. And the specific season we're going to be looking at for the purposes of this video is his 2018-19 season with the Pelicans. And he got more opportunities with that team later in the season once Anthony Davis was shut down on occasion. And he'd always really been able to score inside when given the chance. It's just that he couldn't do much else. So once he got to New Orleans and they needed the offense that he could provide, his numbers went up. Now, his splits aren't as crazy as some other players that we're going to talk about in this video, but he did manage to turn that end of the season production into now a rotation role with the Pelicans. But for me, this seems more like a case of Okafor finding a team that needs his offense off the bench and is willing to deal with the bad defense, and finding a rotation role that fits the skills that he's always had, rather than fake improvement from the Josh Jackson effect, because the numbers post All-Star break aren't crazy good compared to the pre-All-Star break ones. They're really up and down. There's not that sharp contrast from before February to after February. So it really was the situation he found himself in and the fact that the Pelicans are willing to work with the skill set that he has and the skill set that he's had ever since he's been in the league, rather than any kind of fake improvement from the Josh Jackson effect as a result of increased minutes, opportunities on a bad team post All-Star break. And now to wrap the video up, let's talk about 2 rookies that have had this Josh Jackson effect label on them as well. And the first is RJ Barrett. And for me, I don't really think that he is this type of guy. Now, yes, the March stats in terms of the splits are really, really strange and they're kind of eye-popping, but keep in mind, it's only a handful of games, and similar to Okafor, he has examples of both good and bad play before and after the All-Star break. And really that's the line that we're looking at here, is if a player is really bad before the All-Star break and then really good after the All-Star break, then maybe they can be in this Josh Jackson effect type category. But for Barrett, it's just been kind of an up and down rookie season. I think when you watch this guy play, he shows skills that can translate at the NBA level, and he shows improvement as a player, whether it's passing vision or his decision making. And that doesn't always translate to the per game stats, but I don't think that he is a Josh Jackson effect type guy, again, just because of the up and down nature of his stats, rather than such a sharp contrast similar to Okafor. But the other rookie that I want to talk about that I think is absolutely almost a textbook Josh Jackson effect player is Coby White. And him and Cam Reddish, in my opinion, are the 2 guys from this draft class that exhibit this effect most clearly. Now, that doesn't mean that both of them can't sustain this level of production and become good players next season and moving forward, but White specifically, as I already talked about with Reddish in that previous video, checks all the boxes. He's on a bad team. He had some pretty bad early season stats and a huge jump post All-Star break in both his per game stats and his efficiency. Now, I'm hoping that this is just legit improvement from him and that he's getting the opportunities that he is getting because he's earned them on a team that certainly needs the offense that he can provide. And I think that he is a talented player, and I loved him coming into the draft. But if we're just going off of these statistics here and we're looking at the split from January to February to March, then Coby White, in addition to Cam Reddish, both of those guys right now are on my list as players to watch moving forward as potential Josh Jackson effect type players, of guys that had huge jumps in their per game stats post All-Star break, and they really weren't that good beforehand. Now, at the end of the day, these handful of cases can help us learn a couple of things about this Josh Jackson effect. First If a player that has shown little to no signs of being an efficient and productive player is suddenly one now post All-Star break getting more minutes, then that's a pretty good sign that they might be a Josh Jackson effect player. And it's most common on really bad young teams. Players that couldn't even get very many minutes on a really bad team, suddenly getting those minutes and putting up big stats. However, if they've had significant stretches of legitimately good play in past seasons, early in the season, pre-All-Star break, then they might just be an overlooked player finally getting the minutes that they deserved, like, for example, Malik Beasley. So there's a couple of different layers to this. We can definitely learn some things by looking at some of these players and comparing them to some of those players that are a little bit more solidified as true Josh Jackson effect type players. And yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.